grab a seat there. We'll have a discussion with everybody up here at once. And then one thing I'd like to just interject into the evening, we do a little thing called 60-second spots. That's an opportunity for anybody in the room to grab the microphone. I think it might be a good idea to do that tonight as well, because I think there might be people here in the room that are doing some interesting things in security that other people might want to know about. So after this chat, if you're interested in grabbing this microphone for a very quick, I mean seriously, 60 seconds, little spot, just come hang out over here or just make yourself known and we'll make it happen. All right, guys, we're fucked. No. Sorry, Jimmy. You got it? Yeah, it seems like every day that goes by, there's a new story in the news with regard to how things are being compromised. I think just this morning I read about a self-driving car or something that was hacked from 10 miles away, a Jeep, right? So this is the very, very beginning of that chapter, I have a feeling. And hackers are, it's like whack-a-mole, right, guys? It's like as soon as you think you have something figured out, you're banging it, and then they're popping up somewhere else. So the solutions are always around the corner, and it takes massive effort and really smart people to figure out these problems. That's the reason you guys are all hiring, right? Is there ever going to be a point where we're around the corner at some point, or are we always going to be chasing our tails? Or is the fact that these guys are working hard to disrupt our lives keep you guys in business, right? Why don't we start there?
I think, to answer the question, are we ever going to get ahead of this? I don't think we will. I've worked over the years in a number of areas. I used to run a reasonably large consumer email system that was subject to a lot of spam. And every time we thought we were getting ahead of the spammers would find a new and interesting way to either use ourselves as an attack vector out to our customers or figure their way around the systems and processes that we had. And with the advent of stuff like two-factor authentication, we're adding complexity into the security model, and we're making it harder for people to get access to the data. But then people sacrifice some degree of convenience to achieve that level of security. And I think the challenge that's ahead of us now is to figure out ways of accessing people's desire for convenience, but not sacrificing security for that. I think a more famous man than me said, those that would sacrifice liberty for security will lose both and deserve neither. And I think they were referring to governments in that respect. But when it comes to protecting your data, you can have it easy or you can have it secure. And I think the industry does need to look into how we can bust some of that complexity, because people are lazy, right? And you're probably lazy about protecting your security until such a point somebody gets hold of your social security number and starts applying for credit cards, or somebody is able to access corporate documents and then use that after they've been terminated in a lawsuit against their employers. So we're often brought in to protect people's information after the horse has bolted. So I think just having that conversation and making it sort of like an open discussion around how we can be more secure and what we should be securing, I think is where we start. Anyone else?
Absolutely. Great question, by the way. And my answer is, I hope not. And the reason I hope not is not just because of job security. The really cool thing about this field is we're constantly playing catch up with the innovation that's happening elsewhere. We're now all focusing on the Jeep that gets taken over. We're focusing on whether IoT and our households are going to be at risk. But at the same time, we're recognizing new interesting conveniences. Won't it be cool to have driverless cars? Won't that make the roads potentially safer? Isn't our household going to be, a more easily managed place to have control over our appliances? I tend to be the optimist looking at those opportunities. On the fringe, we as a security industry have a challenge, and that is to try to keep up with the innovation that's taking place. And this is innovation that some of you are driving in the marketplace that have nothing to do with security. You're going to have to figure out the security elements and challenges as you build towards maturity, and we as an industry have to figure out the new approaches to secure those challenges. And as we move across, we're slowly but surely fixing things and making them more and more secure, whether it's better payment mechanisms or better ways to protect data or more secure networks to operate on. And we'll continue to see that evolution, if you will, of addressing the security challenges. But we'll never leapfrog past the interesting innovation that actually influences our daily lives.
Yeah, in my opinion, I don't think so. And the reason is slightly different. One, security is not innovating, right? We are always playing catch up. Innovation happens somewhere else, and then we go to those folks and say, okay, your baby is ugly. Here's what you need to do to fix it, right? So that's part of the problem. The other one being, if you look at the track record of security industry, we have done an awesome job of keeping ourselves employed, right? We started with the antivirus thing back in the 90s, and then we had firewalls, and then if that was not enough, we came up with IDS and then WAF, and we just keep coming up with bandit solutions and not really solve the problem, right? You only need to look at one fact. We were talking about two-factor authentication on the day that a Jeep was hacked. Is there such a wide gap that we need to cover? I don't think we will be able to catch up. My hope, and I'm cautiously optimistic about it, is we will be able to get to a place where we are able to respond and contain in a much better fashion than we are able to do today. It would not take us 200 days to figure out, okay, someone hacked us, right? It would be more like a few hours at the max. So.
Yeah, so I'll be a little bit disruptive in my answer. I am probably not as optimistic or more optimistic, depending on how you look at it. I think if you look at the why, you've got to ask the question, why and what do they want? And you go back to, I agree with most of the comments being made where they're always going to be ahead of us. However, we can make their job a whole lot harder than we do. If you think of countermeasures, if you think of looking at launching counter attacks against these guys, it's the old adage of you drive in the neighborhood and you want to rob a house. And you go to the first house and you see locks and bolts on every door, you see an ADT sign and 3 Dobermans and a chain link fence. You go, that's probably a little bit hard. Then you get to the second house and you've got the kids playing in the backyard, the front door wide open, the mom yelling somewhere upstairs, and somebody can walk right in, take something, and walk right out unnoticed. So it gets back down to, not necessarily giving up and getting to the point of saying they're always going to be ahead of us, but make it more difficult for them and make somebody else the target. If you think about creating a secure environment where you're more secure than the next guy, that gives you a little bit of an edge and an advantage.
So just kind of echoing on that, one thing that we see a lot of CloudFlare is, one is in the hacker forums, there's a rate sheet for attacking a website, and it's now gotten to the point where if you are behind CloudFlare or one of our competitors, that there's literally a different price for trying to attack one of those websites. And then one of the other things is as soon as the customer comes on us, the attack usually just stop. So we end up not even having to protect them just because the attackers kind of give up and move on to the next vulnerable site, the site that doesn't have the ADT sticker in front of it.
So it's safe to say that hackers are innovators also then, isn't it? So they're the talent pool that you're after.
Well, it's an interesting situation because I think we've all read the books from decades ago when it was script kiddies and people just trying to show off and do damage, and now we're dealing with foreign governments and cyber criminals that are better organized than some of the companies that we work for. The opportunity and the payoff is serious. So it's a very different set of motivations. And it's a hell of a lot of it's a very different set of resources. I don't know that we'd necessarily be able to easily hire away from the North Korean hacking team, but you're right, there's a great skill set there.
Actually,
one comment on that, we can encourage kind of more ethical hacking by making sure all your companies have a bounty program where you guys are encouraging hackers to push the boundaries of your systems and giving them an opportunity and an outlet to actually report issues in a kind of ethical way. I think today you mentioned the Jeep hack. One of the big outcries from that is not that the Jeep was vulnerable, but it's how the hackers and the reporter chose to test the vulnerability. They were literally on a highway going 70 miles an hour, and the reporter let the hackers cut off their engine. Then not only potentially endangered himself, but endangered everyone else on the highway. So it's give your customers or your hackers, give them a kind of an ethical way to continue to challenge themselves and report it to you guys.
Actually, along those lines, does everybody here understand the fundamentals of responsible reporting? So a couple of people. As Dane is describing, to actually put a program together to encourage the hacking community to have an opportunity to get rewarded, to find vulnerabilities in your product, and responsibly report to you, so you have an opportunity to correct and rectify ahead of their separate disclosure of whatever vulnerability they discovered. It's a fundamental program that every website or application should have in place, so that you actually encourage the community to help you to make your product or service better.
And you're paying them if they breach it.
Yeah, but it's a lot less expensive than the consequences of not.
And just to expand on that, I don't think it's also about applications now, right? We're talking about physical devices. There was a recent case of a security researcher that claimed to issue a command to an aeroplane in flight to climb. And that was not, I believe, treated in a responsible way. In that case, the FBI basically, arrested the person because it was endangering an aircraft, when actually what they were trying to do was highlight, and the jury's out on whether it was actually a genuine attempt or not. But if somebody is going down the lines of responsibly reporting that, you should incentivize them for that rather than penalize them, because that's how you turn somebody into a black hat who's going to go after you maliciously.
There was a question.
Yeah, just you mentioned about some kind of hacking audit services. Where can we find them?
I wouldn't call them hacking auditing services. We use a bounty program called HackerOne, where it's a platform where people can report the issues, and it lets us triage them and respond to them, and then give a disclosure policy for if we don't respond in X number of days, lets them disclose the vulnerability. It gives them the outlet to responsibly disclose.
Interesting. Are there any services out there that actually would assess your website or product for vulnerabilities?
Yeah, there are several companies out there that do penetration testing in different fields.
Cool.
Yeah, so as far as getting someone to do what we call either attack or penetration testing, or really like red team testing, right? You have a pretty good list of companies that do that. Ernst & Young being one of them. They have ASC, what we call Advanced Security Center. I believe it's in Houston, right? I used to be at ENY. That's how I know, and part of that practice. So the big fours will have it. I prefer ENY for obvious reasons. But you have ISAC partners. You have Cigital. So you can go through the list, and depending on which layer you are trying to attack. Is it the application layer? Are you trying to do, it's all, testing is not equal, right? So depending on where you want to test and how you want to test, you may want to assess the strengths of the company that you are going to hire. But that's one very good way of assessing your posture. I probably prefer that a bit more than the bounty program, just because we are we are hashing out how to use bounty program, right? There is a lot of good that comes from it, but there's a lot of bad or useless information that comes from it as well.
Yeah, I would just say, to add to that, if you're a publicly traded company, the bounty programs open up a whole bunch of other issues from a risk perspective that you can't get into, right? But we do a lot of attack and penetration testing, as you mentioned. When we go in and we look at clients, we say not only do we don't just look at the security anomalies, we also look at where are the points of weaknesses across the organization that they could get in. Where are there, for instance, silos in an organization where one department doesn't talk to another, and there's an opportunity to get in there. So there's as we mentioned, a lot of companies out there that do that.
One other area, because it does strike me that most of us in this room are in the software industry, and it's worth it to either source from your staff or source from outside guidance on secure software lifecycle development. to develop a proper threat model about the product or service that you're delivering, even if you're not able to deliver on all the security promises, but to be thinking about the kinds of threats that you're likely to be experiencing in the actual PRD and functional spec process, so that when the developers are actually working on the product, they're delivering something that addresses those threats.
I would go one step further and say, when you're either using third-party vendors or you're outsourcing some of your stuff, you should put some of this in the contract itself, right? The kind of security that you expect, the quality of code, and that should determine the price. And I'll come to M&A in a minute, because that's another thing that we need to talk about in security space more often. The fact that you have emerging economies, and we are really moving towards a globalized world, and a lot of our operations are interconnected. And there's not a whole lot of quality control, to be very honest, in some of the emerging economies, right? Where some of your most critical applications are being written, and you are getting code from them. How do you know? What is the guarantee of the code that you're getting, right? How do you prevent it? Forget about operating in that country. The code itself is not reliable. So my advice would be to just bake it into your contract itself and factor that into the price negotiations. And the other one being M&A. So when you acquire a company, I think Cisco has started to do this, where the price of the company that you're trying to acquire should take into factor the quality of software. When I say quality, that includes security, right? The quality of code in place. Because if you are going to retrofit it for next 10 years, you should pay a lower amount.
Just to add on to that piece quickly, as we look at companies in the acquisition space where a company is buying another company or being acquired by another company, increasingly you look at where the policy world is heading. They're looking at auditing standards for cybersecurity and requiring boards to have fiduciary responsibility over cybersecurity and checklists now. We're also starting to see, as the acquisition gets through, like if you think of all the companies in here that are represented, if each one of you were getting bought today, we would assign a cyber risk score to your company. And what we would do is look at that and audit your cybersecurity practices, your policies, understand how you're thinking about it from a product life cycle, what you're integrating, where the broader areas of risk are, and score you on a, say 1 to 10 scale, whatever. And price goes into consideration at that point. So we're actually talking about the price of the acquisition of a company being influenced by how cyber secure these companies are in terms of their operations and activities. So I think something to think about as you look and you're growing your companies, either getting ready to IPO. I used to work at AVG Technologies. When we took AVG public 3 years ago, we had 6 pages of disclosure in our foreign filing on cybersecurity. Today, they went on a follow-on a couple of weeks ago, and there were about 26 pages on cybersecurity. So it's changing, the risk language. But think about that as you're building your companies and growing.
Just one more thing, right? So the regulators are finally getting their act together. So FCC is looking after, they are going after companies, and you will see government getting stricter, and you'll see the audit requirements getting stricter. Not only for, they won't just look at the general or the SOX control. They will really look at your security posture as part of their audits. That's what I see happening pretty soon.
So I had a question from an infantry line perspective, because when I sit down with my friends and we all work in the Valley in very large enterprises, there's an ongoing issue that's happening, and there's an area gap that no one's addressing related to the CIO office, the security architect, syncing up with enterprise architects and understanding the balance and ROI, because to stay the secure as possible, you should never ever use data ever, and you should just lock up everything. And then there's the balance of, I still have a business to run. And it seems, from an infantry line perspective, it's an ongoing challenge every step of the way. And no one really offers solutions. Everyone wants to offer the magic pill of, let me come into your company and I'll solve it. And then, oh, wait a minute. What I didn't really understand that's happening.
I think that's starting to change. Based on my experience, what we are starting to see is, you're seeing a holistic view of security across the company, right? Starting at the board level and going down to the ICs. The other thing, and you mentioned this, and it's true in many cases where, the security teams wants to, of course, do security, but then there is a business to run, and there is always a conflict. At the end of the day, if you have good, capable security folks in the company, they would look at the risk and the business case of, okay, here is the investment you'll be making, here are the trade-offs you're making, and then put it to the execs in that language, right? Because otherwise, if you just tell them you're making your security better, it's not going to go anywhere. You have to talk to the CIOs in terms of the risk, not only today, but in case you get compromised, the amount of fines or whatever you'll have to pay, the lawsuits and all that, right? So you put a price tag on it, even if it's a rough guesstimate, I think that changes tone of conversation quite a bit.
I think there's just a gap within the security community of understanding from an enterprise architecture perspective. It's a very myopic perspective, and that myopic perspective has to brighten from a functionality standpoint.
Yeah, I would add, I think that gap exists also between the CIO and the CISO and the rest of management, right? So you've got, how many, we talk to boards all the time. The first question I ask is, has your CIO or your CISO come and presented to you guys about security and the state of security in the company? 90% of the time the answer is no, or if so, well, we gave them an hour, but we were running late, so they only got 5 minutes or 10 minutes to pitch their case. And so, there's a gap at that level as well, and I think it's changing. We're starting to see them get much more interested. The words fiduciary responsibility get their attention, and they're starting to pay attention. They're starting to ask the questions, and they're starting to force the collaboration top down and bottoms up. But you have a little bit of a challenge in that you have a very technically competent person over here and a very business competent person over here. They're two different languages. There's a translation required in the middle. Really hard to bridge that gap. And I think that's the same gap that you're talking about, but it's starting to change slowly.
Yeah,
yeah, the gap is, the nuances of the gap are many and varied. If you try talking to someone at the C-level about threat modeling or security assessment or something like that, chances are they're going to start ignoring you, because when they hear a threat model, they don't know what it means. If you try to explain it to them in terms of, well, what are you up against? Then they'll just say, well, that's your job, you figure it out. The problem is you can't institute security without buy-in from the C-levels and from the board. At best, they're going to tell you to stop. At worst, after you're done, there won't be anything left for you there. You'll have to leave. Then they'll go through and tear everything out. It's really an uphill battle. It's almost not worth fighting on a lot of fronts.
I think part of that is not necessarily just talking about the security risks, but translating that into what the business risk is, translating that into how dollars can escape from your bottom line every time you leak data out. And I think that for me, it's about being appropriate, right? You can't go in with the scaremongering tactics to say there's hackers in your network and they're taking all of your data. It's about understanding what data has the most value to it and applying an appropriate level of protection to that. There's a lot of regulatory requirements now that certainly publicly traded companies or any, if you're handling healthcare data, there's a certain set of controls around that. And there's real fines and real penalties applied to businesses that don't follow that. And I think, what we're dealing with now is that a lot of CIOs and a lot of CTOs in traditional businesses are trying to get their head around, well, I can protect the data while it's in my own network, but our data's growing legs and it's walking out into all of the cloud services. How do we protect that? How do we not only, because the customer doesn't put, in Okta, we're asking companies to protect their data, to entrust login to them, right? And that means that if they can't log into the service, we've DDoSed their business. But no company says, well, Adobe uses Okta. But if Adobe got a data breach through us, they wouldn't be, oh, well, Okta, you gave away our data. It would be the customer's like, Adobe, what have you done to protect our data? So the CIOs have an extra challenge, is not only applying those controls to their own infrastructure, but to the myriad of cloud services that businesses use and protect. And I think that's actually the greater challenge now.
You want to talk about the air gap? So just a quick comment on the air gap, and I've been in the security industry coming on 20 years, and the market's changed. Awareness has changed dramatically. I'm not going to say that there's a perfect understanding in every organization of the language we're using, the problems we're identifying, and we haven't done a perfect job of translating them into their business terms and attaching an ROI. But we've gotten better at it. And I can tell you that just with Authy compared to last companies I've had, the involvement by VCs is amazing. The number of VCs that have introduced us to portfolio companies because they're worried about the posture of that company and their investment is something I've never seen before. And it's because they're recognizing that their precious assets at risk. With that comes greater awareness at the board level. It's not going to happen overnight, but the awareness is getting better. And if we can actually do a better job of explaining the problems in business terms that tie to the P&L, it will get a lot better in terms of being able to justify the investment. There are norms that are now established that you can look up where studies have been done on the average cost of a breach, studies that have been done on the necessary levels of investment in a specific industry. You can look at your spend cumulatively, and you can at least start to identify the opportunity to increase the spend, get the expertise, and improve the, or diminish the air gap, if you will.